Well, why don't we go ahead and do that? Let's start with roll call attendance. Ralph Dormitzer,
Ralph Dormitzer, present.
Corey Evans,
Corey Evans here, present.
Susan Franklin,
Susan Franklin, present.
Mike Dick,
Mike Dick here.
Francine Lyons, no Francine, and Brian Host, present. Okay, so the time's 5:37. We're in session, and we should jump right into it. I would apologize, I was a few minutes late. I had one request just to forward the draft stabilization fund policies, which I had done a little while ago, but apparently the attachment wasn't there. So I went back and found an earlier version, resent that as you were meeting. And hopefully everybody either has the original one sent out a couple weeks ago or the one I just sent over a few minutes ago with the policies attached.
Brian, is this the document that's titled with the date 10/3/23 with SB edits, just so we're all in the same version?
Hold on a second.
That's what Brian just sent.
If that's what I just sent, that's the best I've got. Yeah.
Excellent.
I got it on the,
Which
yeah,
one?
I got it on the 4th. So yes.
Okay, thank you.
And again, I want to be clear, this is a draft. I'm not aware of any other committee that has voted this into final form. So the purpose tonight, I think, really is to have an open meeting discussion amongst all the members as to what key issues may need to be further addressed in these policies. And we will pass those recommendations and suggestions on to the select board in particular, who I think is really controlling the document. So the first up are the two facilities, the two stabilization funds. They're both in the same document. They largely follow the same form. And I've allocated 30 minutes to either, roughly speaking. So why don't we start with roads and sidewalks? Even though that is the second of the two funds. And I'd really just open it up. I mean, we haven't had a team discussion on this, and I'd love to get people's views on whether this is sufficient from their perspective or whether it needs further explanation, in which case Gina and Michelle may be able to help, or whether it needs further explanation actually in the document, in which case we should talk about some edits.
So Brian, I just want to let you know Paul Grady's also on.
Hi, Paul. Welcome. So even more help. We discussed as a team, I think, the concepts of these stabilization funds and the purpose and in terms of the end use of these funds. And at least my interpretation of our discussion on that matter was that that's not where the concerns resided in either one of these. It was really more about the policies. But let me just start perhaps by asking if anyone has any questions about where the money's going for the road and sidewalk funds, and whether or not anyone has any concerns around the dollar amount. Because if those two items, if everyone's on board, I think with those two aspects of this, the 800,000 per year for roads and sidewalks specifically, then really it just comes down to a discussion of the policy or building a comfort level with the policy.
I have some major concerns on the stabilizations in general, and specifically on the roads and sidewalks.
Okay, let's start with you then, Michael.
All right. There's no question in my mind that we need the additional money per year, but where I have a hard time agreeing to it is that my feeling is that the town manager should be finding that $800,000 per year within the levy, that it should not be a stabilization fund, and that I don't have a solid feeling that the town manager has done enough to squeeze out that necessary funds. This goes back to our town's reluctance to put money into maintenance and to put money into expansion. And my personal feeling is that expansion has to wait until we get our maintenance together. and that we get on the road to good maintenance for not only roads and sidewalks, but also our buildings. So right now, I am not in support of it for that reason. No question that the money's needed, but I want to urge or feel that, yeah, we really are doing everything we can to squeeze the money out of the levy, and not allocating expansion projects. That's how I feel now.
So let me ask a question. We've got 3 weeks until town meeting. Is there anything that so first of all, your concerns are heard. I just want to be completely clear. Is there anything that could actually be done in the next several weeks that would be sufficient to hypothetically convince you that everything possible had been done? Or what is it that would be constructive to do in the next 3 weeks, in that direction? Or is this, which is perhaps just a polite way of asking the question, at least in terms of your vote, is this dead on arrival, or is this something where people could actually gather some information to perhaps impact your vote?
I guess, Brian, the way I see it right now is that I'm sounding an alarm now, and that I would want to give the town manager a chance to redo that budget, particularly as we come into annual town meeting next spring. I mean, so I don't think it's fair to say, oh yeah, they can show me the following efforts that they've tried to make to pare down the budget, find money from other accounts, and put it into a road maintenance account. I'm basically saying, whoa, wait a minute now. If I've been able to do that a year ago and we didn't see anything, then we could be asking them, okay, show us why you didn't come up with this. But we're basically asking them, not we, I am asking them now, find the money before we go to a stabilization fund, because it is a tax increase, very hard to reverse. And you're also affecting many people in this town that are not able to afford that increase easily. So let's be absolutely sure that we have done everything we can to avoid a tax increase. That's where I'm coming from. And it's not only this road stabilization fund, but I would go further and say on the school stabilization funds. But that's another topic for later in this meeting. But for roads and sidewalks, that's where I sit right now.
Okay, I'm just trying to think of the plan of the path forward in the plan. It sounds like you're not sort of the mindset to try to resolve this in the next 3 weeks, and that your position is what it is. Is that fair?
Yeah, there's actually another area too that I feel we have not done due diligence, and that is the concept of a special purpose stabilization fund is a new concept, and I don't feel it's been properly socialized. Yes, we've been told why it's needed, and yes, we've been told how much the median property would be assessed, but I just feel that there's parts of the mechanism that we don't know yet, and perhaps the policy that you distributed, and I did go through it and made quite a few notes on it. I don't think it's ready for prime time. I think there is a hard push to get this town moving in the right direction, and that's laudable. But at the same time, it's a tax increase, and it's hard to reverse. And we better be damn sure we know what we're in for. And then I also understand, and this is very concerning to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that our finance director has given her notice, and these are her ideas. Now, it's not that we're not intelligent enough to understand the concept, but I don't think we really truly understand the ins and outs. And Jennifer Mullen, I'm sure does, with her experience with these stabilization funds in towns that she's come from. But we haven't had a chance to have that talk with her, to have a conversation with her, to ask her point blank, okay, we know what the upside is. What are the downsides? What should we be concerned with? What do we need to protect ourselves from as we implement these stabilization funds? To me, the stabilization funds should be for annual town meeting. And I know we have controversy over special town meeting versus annual, but I do fall in the camp that annual town meeting is where we really do our town really decides on how we're spending our money overall. And that special town meeting is for particular projects that really need to go forward now. So those are some additional thoughts on the topic for me.
Okay, so in levy versus new tax, better understanding of the mechanism, and ATM versus STM. It sounds like we could make some progress on the second item this evening, with Chris and Jean and Paul and Michelle on, recognizing that these were Jen's ideas. I think, other people have done a lot of work on them as well. So that may be worth spending some time on, but I want to hear from other committee members as to how they feel about this roads and sidewalk stabilization fund, and what would be useful as a team conversation tonight and over the course of the next 3 weeks.
I'll hop in. I'm not as sensitive to the tax increase concerns as Mike is, understandably, on both sides. I mean, not to say that either of us, one is a proper position or not. There's a few things about, so putting that aside, there's things about this mechanism, this fund, that I do appreciate, which is, it's almost to Mike's point earlier about how we got here. How we got here was, I'll use the word encroachment, it's a little bit loaded, but the growth of different expenses that the town has, mainly when it comes to full-time equivalents, FTEs, whether they're in the staff or in the schools or the services. Those budgets have been growing, and we've seen since the Capital Stabilization Fund was established in 2009, I think it was, right, that has not grown. So there's been a disproportionate decrease in what we spent on capital versus what we spent on people. And I think some of that is just natural in the course of budgeting. Sitting through labor negotiations and sitting through discussions with residents that wanted to have somebody that picked up the phone for them. Seeing on this other side, there's real pressure to add resources on the schools as well when it comes to children and the ability to access resources that extend beyond just the classroom. And I think at the time, it's hard to argue against those, right? It's one person, but as we see, it all adds up. And then you end up where we are today, where we have a roads and sidewalk cost that is vastly exceeding our ability to fund it. Maybe not vastly, but appears to be getting to the point where we cannot fund it in the same level just because of the increase in expense of paving, never mind sidewalk work. So what I appreciate about this fund is that it is protected. This is, if we did a general override, that money would be gone. If we did one-time debt exclusion, you do a project and then we'd have to figure out what to do in 30 years or whatever it is. This can't be touched by any of those things. And this is really the only mechanism that the residents will be able to vote on every time. And we'll have very clear accounting for what we're working on and what the money's being collected for. And if we don't like it, if we feel like the road fund has a bunch of money in it that has not been spent, or the projects that are being done aren't being done well, or whatever our case is, there's a mechanism for the town to say that this isn't working anymore. So I like that it's protected. I also like that there's a pretty strong feedback loop. So when it comes to the tax increase and the concept of this, one, not as concerned, and two, I like the mechanism. When it comes to the policy, there's two kind of questions I have. One is, I found the final sentence of bullet one, that the road fund shall include the amount approximately. I agree that talks about capital stabilization funds as well as the road stabilization fund. I would prefer to take that amount out. I think we can, as a good faith as a committee, say we'll continue to fund this. But I do worry about having an amount in there, in both directions, right? Whether we don't meet it or whether we have to meet it or whether it goes down. I think that's better just left up to the committee along with Brian Joyce to determine how much it's going to be. But we can understand that it is expected that the Cohasset Capital Stabilization Fund will contribute to these funds. I also would add just in the text a little bit about these are going to be in addition to Chapter 90 funds, just so there's no confusion about, oh, those come in, do those reduce the stabilization fund? I do think we should make that clear. And then the second bullet, until such time as the town determines that deferred maintenance of roads and sidewalks has been stabilized and the annual contribution to the road fund may reduce to an amount sufficient to fund current annual maintenance. I kind of understand what the concept is. I think that sentence could be cleaned up. Because on one hand, you could read it that there's an expectation that this fund is going to go away, which I'm not sure is the case. If it's for deferred maintenance, that's okay. But it also says it's for continued, new work. So that sentence kind of, to me, left me a little confused. And then finally, on the amount, back to the 2009, level funding, which is negative funding of the capital stabilization fund. So back of the napkin math was that we were about $900,000 under appropriated for capital funding. This gets us pretty close. So if we were to take a 60,000 foot view, twice as far as 30,000 feet, and say, how are we going to catch up to where we should have been? This is a little bit of a shot of nitrous for that. This gets us for capital funding to a place where we should have been. And the cost is that the taxpayers have to pay more. And if they say no, that's great. That's absolutely fine. But it does, for purposes of capital funding, it doesn't make the town whole, but it gets us up pretty close. It also, I think, gives us the right perspective to say, and we said this a few meetings ago, we have our new level funding. We have this new funding level with this new fund. And every year we want to see the capital stabilization fund grow to the point where hopefully maybe we can take away some of these short-term funds. So if that's the goal, if we want to get to a new healthy point in capital funding, this gets us there and it gets us on a good path to kind of set the next 15 years up so that we can get back to where we were without repeating the same mistake. That was a lot. My apologies, everybody. Thanks.
That's helpful, Corey. Two things on the language. You drew attention to two very important points. First of all, this is not intended to suggest that capital budget will continue to spend $300,000 out of the regular capital stabilization fund each year. This is intending to say that this fund would not only replace that $300,000, but it would spend another $500,000, getting us up to the total of $800,000. Plus, the Chapter 90 gets us up to $1 million. And that's the funding plan. So you read this. It's interesting that you read it the way that you did. It's interesting because that means other people can too, but that's not what it's intending to say.
Yeah, I think that the word "otherwise" there probably to me was.
Yeah.
I read that to be instead of or not. You know what I'm saying? I read that in.
Yeah. So the bottom line is we need to clarify that language to make it clear that this is the funding source for roads and stuff. I mean, it's nothing that would stop capital from in the future dedicating some additional amounts if we so chose, but this replaces the $300,000. We will not be spending. There's no plan to be spending $300,000 out of regular capital in the future once this fund is established.
We could maybe just recommend to strike that whole sentence. I mean, if it's up to us, and as long as there's no expectation to continue to fund.
Right.
Then I don't think we have to intentionally, phrase an inverse. So
right. This is really intended to fund, the full annual amount of our annual road paving cycle.
Okay, and that's important. Okay, and then
This
in
plus the
addition to
chapter 90. Yeah, this plus the chapter 90 is basically to provide for the full annual amount of roughly $1 million in current year costs.
So maybe that final sentence, the road fund shall be combined with chapter 90 fund for the total expenditure on roads and sidewalks, something like that. Just
Yeah, so you
leave
could
it
say
in
in
the
the road
affirmation.
fund. Okay, so the purpose of the road fund is to address road and sidewalk expenses. And the road fund combined with chapter 90 funds. Sorry.
Or the road fund shall be combined with chapter 90 funds for this purpose. Something like that.
For this purpose.
And then for the second bullet, I would, sorry, Brian, tell me when you're done.
Hold on a second. It's to address annual road and sidewalk expenses. How about that?
That's great.
Or
Brian, would you mind sharing your screen so we can see what you're working on?
I'm writing this by hand, Michael. So that won't
I got it, Mike. I got it.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm old school.
No, I can be tech support. I did that for years.
So basically, you're gonna in the second line, the purpose of the road. So you can put in 800,000. The road fund be 800,000. The purpose of the road fund is to address. Insert the word annual road and sidewalk expenses, and then delete the rest of it. Okay, and the road fund shall be combined with chapter 90 funds for this purpose.
Yeah.
And that just takes away all this ambiguity with regards to, the capital stabilization fund and free cash.
Gives us flexibility on both directions.
Yeah. I mean, if we want to do it, we can, but it's not setting an expectation. It's
correct. As we said with the school fund, if, we're 10 grand short, on doing something that needs to be done, we want the flexibility there.
Yeah. Is there language we might want to add here that sets the expectation that this would cover the full paving plan, the full annual paving plan? Because that is the intent.
I think it says that the purpose of the road fund is to address annual expenses. I think that is what we've done here. Okay. I don't know if.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay.
All right. And then on the second bullet,
Actually,
I just wonder, oh, sorry, Susan.
Well, it does start with the clause target funding floor, meaning that's the lowest.
Right.
Which goes to a little bit of my concern with it, is that it's a little too squishy. I would feel better if this were more defined. We've always talked about having a plan for our roads, and I do understand the fact that there's been an increase in the cost of paving and the like, but I think there's a contradiction, and Corey, I think you mentioned it, that in some places it basically says that this is going to be in place until we catch up on where we got behind. But then it also talks about, other things that don't really speak to that same, sort of structure. So to me, I would like it better if we're doing this for a specific number of years to catch up on, what we're behind on, and then it sunsets.
Okay, so we should clarify that too. The language that suggests this is catch up is inaccurate. This is not about deferred maintenance at all. This is the annual cost going forward. It's $1 million a year. I mean, that's what Brian has presented to us. That's what Brian has presented to the select board, excuse me. And so this language is just inappropriate given at least the disclosure that's been provided to date. So I just think that setting an expectation that, we're, this is the reason we're behind, it's not. and that, you know, if we throw this money at it for a short period, you know, for a few years, we're going to catch up, and then it's going to go away. That's also not accurate. So I think we need to cut that language.
Brian, I'm looking at, I guess it's 1, 2, 3rd bullet, and in my notes, my commentary on it, on that 3rd bullet, I have this question. Should the enabling language include a definition of criteria to validate that the deferred maintenance of roads and sidewalks is stabilized? And should the enabling language include a threshold that triggers a reduction in the fund?
This gets back to whether or not we're stabilizing deferred maintenance or we're funding the annual cost going forward. I've heard nothing. I've heard nothing, period, okay, that suggests this is about, you know, catching up. I mean, the reason we're behind is because we've been sitting on a pile of money for 3 years and not paving roads.
Correct.
Okay. And now the cost of roads has gone up substantially, but this isn't, you know, this isn't some big bang of catch up. This is the annual cost of roads going forward. So I'm trying to reconcile that against your comment. I mean, I mean, if there is no catch up and there is no stabilization, there is no way to measure it. I mean, this is just.
Well, it's still possible to have a mechanism where we want to see this fund get incorporated in the general fund. I mean, that's, you know, wishes and fishes, but I mean, if that, I don't know how you'd phrase that either, but you know.
Yeah, I mean, people may feel that way, and that's yeah, I'm trying. It's a slightly separate matter. I just want to. I'll open this to, you know, to Chris, Michelle, and Gene to correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think it's accurate to suggest that this is a catch-up mechanism in any way, shape, or form. Yes, we're behind, but it's not because of funding.
Right. What triggers a reduction? And I think it was Corey, but maybe it was Brian. It
was Corey. You suggested it, and I think Corey, you know, or acknowledged that some people feel that way. Maybe all. The only way that you get a reduction in this is by, you know, forcing, you know, the funding source back into the annual budget and reducing this little by little over time. You couldn't do it. I mean, look, if you tried to do it in one shot, you'd have to cut heads. No one's ever made that suggestion, nor do I encourage anyone to consider that. Although, you know, people can do what they believe. You know, it would, but you could suggest, you know, a mechanism to force it back in over time. Whatever it is, $100,000 a year over 10 years, and 10 years from now, this fund has dropped from $1 million a year or $800,000 a year down to zero, in terms of the additional tax.
Well, maybe a simple way of looking at it is it 41 miles of road? Is that what we have always been told?
I've heard everything from 36 to 41, but.
Yeah, so at some point, you have paved your 41 miles of road. And I know that you're gonna have to go back and pave again, but roads should last a certain amount of time. So at what point, how many cycles do we go through before we actually end up with roads that are in pretty generally good condition overall, before we're like ripping them all up and starting again?
So the target is 20 years, Susan. It's a 20-year cycle. This would replace all of our roads over 20 years. And, you know, when we get to the end of that 20-year cycle, we start all over again.
Mm-hmm.
There's also
Paul Grady has his hand raised.
I'm sorry, Paul. My screen doesn't allow me to see that, but please, Michelle, if you could.
Just to answer Susan's question on that, in discussion of the Roads and Sidewalks Committee, is the roads are in such a condition right now where they have to be completely milled and taken down.
Not all roads.
Well, can I finish, Michael?
There's a portion that do.
Well, would I be able to finish my statement, please? Is that all right?
Of course.
Oh, thank you very much. So in speaking with Brian Joyce, the roads that we have to repair, some of them to hearken to Michael's point there, but for the most part, we have to take them down, and there's 2 coats. When the roads are stabilized, and I'm not saying all, Michael, when the roads are stabilized, then it's a 1-coat deal where they're milled and overlaid. And so it becomes a maintenance project after that. We are, and I'm not saying deferred and pardon, I've got a dog howling in the background, I apologize. But so that's according to Brian, that's where that key point about the costs coming down and becoming more of a stabilization plan. And everyone's right about a 20-year plan, but it's catching up with the roads that have not been addressed. But after that, when they're done, I don't have a time, I wish I did, but we're working on prioritizing the roads that really need it and getting things behind us. And also, again, applying for grants, Brian, that's what we still keep doing, and we'll continue to do so. But that's, I think, Susan, I think that's where you're going with that, is after that, it does become a maintenance plan where you bring it down and you put another coat over it, and you continue to do that as you do the roads. But as they just did Cushing, they had to tear it all up. Elm Street had to tear it up. No, Elm in most regards, Cushing, and after that, that will be 1 coat going forward. So I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you.
And Susan, one thing that occurs to me, I was in the back of my head, I was thinking, well, if we find that this fund is growing and we're not spending it, or we're finding that, money is piling up, we can start unwinding it. But that kind of also made me realize we have a little bit of a moral hazard kind of built into this, where it may encourage the expenditure. So, I think I'm comfortable. I'm more comfortable with the assumption that with the expectation that if we find ourselves over funding, that we can then reduce it, but that may not in practice be what happens. So I do think that's a concern.
It's always very difficult to get people to give the money back.
That's it. Yeah.
Can I have another comment on another bullet, if you're ready to go to another one, or?
Please.
Yeah.
This would be 1, 2, 3, 4. The bullet talks about producing a 3 to 5 year plan from the town staff. There's no real requirement to produce this plan by a date certain prior to the annual town meeting. So what I'm reading here is, it is anticipated, by who I don't know, but it is anticipated that this report shall be requested, by who, in the fall prior to the annual town meeting. So this statement sounds like a wish and perhaps a direction, but I feel that we should have something more solid to produce this 3 to 5 year plan by a date certain prior to annual town meeting.
I just tweak the language a little bit, Mike, just to make it more active, as you were saying.
No, well, yes, that's true too. I mean, but there should be a date certain. It should not be reports shall be requested. It doesn't say shall be produced.
Well, I rephrased it to be, this report shall be ready in the fall. And I think this speaks to the general ability of warrant articles to be ready an appropriate amount of time before town meeting, which is a much larger and more serious issue.
Yep.
I think everyone shares equal amount of fault for. Well, maybe not equal, but we all share a piece of fault for that. So
what I
we have to fix that anyway. Yeah.
Is that we tie this report to the same deadline that the DPW has to meet for their annual request. So I'm not sure if that's January or the end of December, but whatever that date is for their annual needs, that report shall be included for that, with that same date.
I don't know how we write that.
Yeah, I'm just pausing here because right now there isn't a date certain, Michael. It's been moving around, which is part of what's feeding into, our ability to get our work done prior to these meetings, prior to annual and special town meetings.
Yeah.
Right.
So I'm just trying to figure out how to address your concern in this language, recognizing that there's not a reference date to just point to.
How about the report shall be included in I'll use the term DPW's annual request for the following fiscal year.
And then what happens if they drop the request on us late? I'm just thinking out loud.
Right.
Well, I guess I would ask Chris or Michelle, what is the date that the department heads have to have their request in for planning for creating the annual budget for annual town meeting? That would be the date that the report would be due.
So Chris is here to answer that question. And Brian, I also want to let you know Ralph has had his hand up and Paul Grady as well.
Okay, let's go Ralph and then Paul in that order. Sorry.
Am I the one, am I up now?
No, Chris was going to answer the question first, and
Okay.
then we're going to go to your question, then Paul's question. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know what I didn't know what the process was on this. So your question is, to clarify for me, when does the one of the draft budgets for the next fiscal year prepare? Is that what you're asking, Mike?
When are they due into you so that you can begin?
They typically do the very beginning of Jan. We usually get them in the end of December, and we meet with departments beginning of January. That's usually when we do that.
And
That's
then we
for operating budget. That's for operating budget.
Yeah, it's operating. Typically,
that's not for capital.
Yeah, for capital, we typically start in August. That's been a little delayed because everything else we're doing this year. So we're going through that process now. But typically it's August, and we meet in September, October, and go through the details. This time it's going to be a little bit shorter time frame. But that said, we already have a 10-year plan we're working on, so everyone should know what they're looking at.
Right. So if our goal is to have this report produced by a date certain, would you, and the language here generally refers to the fall, would it be fair to ask DPW to have their 3 to 5 year plan prepared by, say, November 30th? If we were to ask for a specific, due date?
Yeah, I mean, for capital, yes, that's definitely, we're definitely in, looking at things at that point.
This is the road plan, Chris. So it's
Yeah,
really-
yeah, exactly.
So,
Yeah.
and it's going to be a rolling plan. So they're going to execute during the summer. They're going to knock off a bunch of things on their list, and then they're going to reprioritize, what they're going to do the subsequent summer based on whatever they got done. So we just need to put in a date here that everyone thinks makes sense is really what it comes down to. Not so much in negotiations, it's just trying to figure out what's the right date to drop in here so that everybody knows that's when the work gets done.
I just want to caveat this by saying, we're doing paving right now, right? It's October.
Okay.
So it's possible that weather could have an impact on some of this, and stuff that may have been planned gets pushed, or maybe stuff gets accelerated. So just so there's always a little bit of flexibility just because of weather with paving, just so you know. Yeah. Okay.
So I think, Mike, you suggested what, November 30th?
Yeah, or it could be December 31st, but it's to have this 3 to 5 year plan, this 3 to 5 year report published on a date certain, rather than just generically saying it shall be, I forget the wording exactly, but it's sometime in the fall is the way it's reading right now. And I feel it should be a date, and a date that fits within Chris's process for preparing for annual town meeting.
Chris, is it fair to assume that the paving is absolutely positively done by November 30th? I got to believe at that point it's too cold, unless we're experiencing global warming.
Yeah, no. Well, yes, with that exception. Generally, the asphalt plants close, I want to say the end of November, maybe December, depending on the year. So yes.
Should we say November 30th, December
Yeah, I think you
15th?
can, I think you could say that with an understanding that we can, we can adjust it if there's
Yeah, I
some.
mean, nobody goes to jail if the date's missed, but
Right,
that's
exactly.
the
At least there's
expectation.
the date. That's
Right.
Yeah,
reasonable.
if you're more comfortable with setting a date like that, I think November 30th should be fine.
Okay.
Thank-
Want to make sure you and your team are.
Brian, I just wanted to interject there and piggyback off Chris if I could, and I'm sorry, Ralph.
No,
just
please.
Then we'll close this chapter. Is that since the Roads and Sidewalks Committee came into play, the report as it exists has become kind of fluid. Again, we bumped up Elm Street, Church Street, and they were coming up next year, or the year after we were trying to finalize Elm and see what we're doing with it. Church Street. So I just want to add that the report will continue to be fluid. We're looking at other roads, say like right down the street. I'm sorry. There's a couple of them that are just coming up, but they're up for 2 years from now. We're pulling it back to 1 and trying to get them done. South Main is going to be a big one coming up. It's depending on what happens, with the sewer connection and everything like that. But I just want to just put that out there that it is a fluid report. And we sometimes grab it like we grabbed Elm, and so I just wanted to put that out there.
No, it's a perfectly fair point, Paul, and a good one. I mean, one thing we should all be able to agree on is the unknown, and that change will occur, right? So, what we'll know as of November 30th is what we got done the prior paving cycle, and what we think is next. And then Mother Nature will come along, and winter will happen, and spring will arrive, and a couple of roads will look very different, right? And so the priorities may change by springtime. So your point's taken.
Right, but it is a 3 to 5 year projection rather than.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, Ralph.
Sorry, Ralph, I think you're up.
Okay. There are a few things I think are really a departure from all procedures we've ever had in the past. Number one is you don't do these kinds of overrides unless you have an emergency and you do them at the regular town meeting. You just simply don't do them now unless you have an emergency. I do not see the emergency either for roads or sidewalks at this moment. And you can talk later about whether you see them or don't see them for schools. But this is not an emergency. And therefore, I do not agree that we should actually do this in the fall town meeting. That's a start. Second, I do think that it is the obligation of the town, and it's always been the obligation of town within its budget, some way or the other, to take care of its roads. To actually foist this off now on a special purpose stabilization fund that the public now pays for separately is a huge departure from normal procedures in almost any other town. This is very unusual. And I think it is entirely reasonable to say that sidewalks are something new and in fact deserve additional funding, because in fact they have not been prioritized or even considered in the past, and therefore there ought to be some way to deal with either sidewalk repair or new sidewalks where appropriate, which I see as an important thing to do. I do not agree that roads are not part of the normal budgeting process and should be done as part of the normal budgeting process, to be perfectly honest with you. So I'm coming down on saying I understand the need for sidewalks and how that's different. It's still not an emergency and deserves to be in the regular town meeting and not this one. Okay. And then finally, why are we in such a pickle on the roads anyway? To a large degree, it's the utilities that have torn up our roads, number one, as you probably all know. And we know also that the natural grid will pay for the repairs on roads they damage, and they have. It takes a while, but they do it. And we use those funds effectively. Unfortunately, when the water department, and perhaps even the sewer department, I don't remember quite clearly on that, but when the water department tears up a road, for example, Elm Street, it does not pay for the repair, which is rather unusual. It would seem to me they're a utility and they have a separate funding and could be doing that, which would take a lot of pressure off of the actual need to fund the roads separately. But anyhow, those are a couple of thoughts. And then finally, if you put in a fund, and this is kind of my sort of structuring of a famous saying, and I'm going to read it to you. It says, usually, you all know this one, the work fulfills the time available for its completion. You're very familiar with that. So the corollary, and this is my own construction, but anyway, spending varies directly with the available income, which means that no matter what you do, if you put aside $800,000 in this fund, it will be spent. People will find ways to do it, and I know, and Paul knows as I know, that there are many people who would like very significant changes in the sidewalks in many places in town, all the way from West Corner and also all along King Street. So you're talking about, once you have a very large fund, things that you might think are nice to do but are not necessary to do could happen in this case. So I find you have to redefine this in some way which prevents things which we would not normally allow for in the normal budgeting process and on prioritization process, which we have always done in the Capital Budget Committee, not allowing those things to happen when we in fact should not be wasting people's money on those things, whether they're absolutely necessary or not. So, and as you know, I was part of that Roads and Sidewalk Committee, and I tried to constrain it to some degree to providing adequate sidewalks within a radius of the schools or other major parts of town, and not make them so broadly available that you could never decide what to do. But I don't believe that funds should be so broadly available that almost anything can be accomplished without necessarily the need. So a lot of other things I could say, but this belongs in the regular town meeting. It needs much more consideration. And broadly, the Capital Stabilization Fund has been a very effective way of prioritizing things and has worked successfully for many, many, many years. It is underfunded and ought to be properly funded. And I would go back to the processes we know do work and allow prioritization. And more broadly, there's all kinds of things that probably don't get done, which in fact now won't get done because we've siphoned off money, and people will very much disagree with additional requests for money for things which should get done but are not now even in the stabilization fund. So I mean, just a lot of things that do not fit anymore in my view here. So sorry to say, be so negative on it, but I believe it's not the right thing to do.
Brian, I can address that for a moment, if I may.
You may.
Well, since Ralph left the committee, we actually took a lot of Ralph's advice, and we have started with the low-hanging fruit. Sidewalks that are decaying, sidewalks that are existing but are in need of attention. We're not looking at sidewalks on King Street. We're not looking at, if for anything, we're looking at the prioritization, I apologize, going towards the schools. Is, say, if we put in a sidewalk variable from the corner of King, going towards Pond, from Pond Street, just in the corner. We have school buses, you have kids crossing, connecting Pond up to the school, which National Grid's going to be covering some of that, but putting sidewalk in there if we can. We're not looking for we're not looking for pet projects. And this money has to be justifiably spent and approved. So I just wanted to put that out there, that no one's looking for pet projects to get something done because they want it. I mean, yes, everyone would love to have a King Street sidewalk. It's not feasible right now because you're looking at a taking, you're looking at a number of things, a number of key issues. So we are looking at existing infrastructure. And if we can fit it in where we can fit it in, all the better. I just wanted to clarify that for a moment.
Okay. I don't see any other hands up. Susan, I think everyone else has spoken on the matter. Any thoughts? I mean, you did as well, but it wasn't, I think in response to Melissa's comment.
Yeah, I was talking about the document and some issues that were in the document, whereas some of the other parties in our group have been talking more about, you know, whether this should be even under consideration for a special town meeting. And to a large extent, I agree with that. I do feel like we are trying to force it. The idea was raised not that long ago. to examine a stabilization fund, and I think maybe a little more diligence would be in order before we would bring this before the town. I think we have a lot of questions, and they're going to have a lot of questions, and that means that the success level of it actually, getting voted at town meeting is limited.
Okay.
I don't,
And I brought up the fund that, when we first looked at this, I brought up the fund that the town of Newton had done. And their fund was specifically to get their roads to a point. And then after that, it was back on the town's, responsibility to maintain them year to year. And that's what I thought we were trying to achieve here, but we've tonight said that that's not the case. That this is just to keep our maintenance of our roads and not catch up.
That is certainly my understanding, and hopefully I haven't imposed my understanding on a broad group of people who are thinking about this a different way. But Chris, Michelle, if I'm misunderstanding this, or Gene or Paul, now's the time to correct it. But everything I've seen from Brian Joyce is that we need to spend $1 million a year on roads. Roughly 2 miles at about 500 grand a mile to hit that 20-year cycle. So I haven't heard anything about this sort of going away, and certainly your point, Paul, is accurate. I mean, if we allow a road like Elm Street to sit milled without a ceiling layer on top, for an extended period of time, it gets completely destroyed, and you have to go all the way to the base. Or similarly, if we just allow a road to fall apart to the point where it gets all the way down into the foundation, we have to go all the way to the base, and that is more expensive, and we shouldn't be doing that. But apart from those rare situations, I mean, the broad road base is not in that condition. So this is, as best I can tell, this is the number, going forward. But if anyone is
Brian, Jean has her hand raised.
Jean, please proceed.
Hey, Brian. So I think that your understanding is correct in terms of this was envisioned as a opportunity to free up some room in the capital stabilization fund while also addressing a longtime desire that those of us who are elected here over and over and over again about the condition of our roads and our sidewalks. And we've seen some of this at recent town meetings with the King Street petition, but more generally all across town. On the money, though, what I would say is that we have had discussions, but they're just too inchoate right now in terms of what the future may hold in terms of reducing the road and sidewalk fund. I don't think it will go down to zero. I would be, that wouldn't be possible if this was a maintenance fund. But so you all know, one of the things that our zoning bylaw working group committee is contemplating is, for example, an impact mitigation requirement in our bylaws, which would be focused on a sidewalk fund. Right now, we have done that in an inconsistent, voluntary way amongst the developers, including those who put forth big projects in our town. Sawyer Street sidewalk, for example, cost $700,000, and that was created by the Avalon developer. The fund set aside for that. There's a lot of towns that more effectively use money from developments to mitigate impacts. We got $10,000 from CHP that was quickly spent on the Elm Street consultant. We got, I want to say, $275 from the Cohasset Estates that was partially spent on the Elm Street consultant. And so part of it is we also need better controls in terms of how that money is allocated and redirected in a consistent stream of money. So that's something that we could look at reducing the fund with once we have a more consistent process in place, but that's going to take a while, and that's going to take town meeting to also adopt something like that impact mitigation fund in our bylaws, which may or may not go. There are many towns surrounding us that have exactly that, and we're looking at models of that. So that's one source. Another source, which I don't hold out a lot of hope for, but there was a millionaire's tax that was passed in terms of road, and that was supposed to go to roads and schools and funding there. And we've asked our state senator and state rep about what we're looking at. Will that, for example, increase what we consider to be Chapter 90 funds in terms of the millionaire's tax and the revenue from that? So far, we haven't gotten any clear answers, but that, you know, again, that's money that supposedly is going to go to road repairs in the future. So I think the bottom line is that, yes, it's envisioned that the vast majority of the fund is going to remain as a catch-up, but also going forward maintenance fund. There could be some opportunities to reduce it, particularly with that impact bylaw, but that's pretty inchoate right now and is going to require probably years to get that stabilized. And so that's sort of the big picture. And it's not ready yet to put certain dates or years out, because we're playing catch up on a lot of things in Cohasset, particularly as compared to our neighbors that have some more sophisticated mechanisms in place like this impact bylaw. So it's just going to take time.
And you have Ralph and Corey with their hands up as well.
Brian, you're muted.
Thanks. Sorry. I didn't see whose hand went up first, but Corey, why don't we start with you?
It was Ralph's. No,
No,
Ralph was
no.
before me by a mile.
So we start with Ralph.
Okay, well, thank you.
No
Just
pun intended.
one thought. I think that almost no one on this call 5 years from now will know what has been said on this call. Nor will the policy fully address everything that we have talked about now. So the real issue is, how do you firm up something which in fact satisfies everyone 5 years from now, when none of us will have will be part of the decision making? And until you get to that point, it doesn't feel as though anything but a pure tax increase with some specifications on it, but no chance or at any time in the future that it would ever be reduced, because we don't have any guarantee that anyone on this call will still be a member of a board who will remember what we're saying here today about it potentially reducing it, no matter what the policies say. So you really have to firm this stuff up better than we're firming it up, to be perfectly honest with you. So that's all I got to say.
Thank you, Ralph. Corey?
Yeah.
So just kind of a little bit of a, I don't want to say gut check, but just kind of a step back here. Yeah, I think that I share a lot of the concerns about kind of date, process, when this should come. But this is kind of at our feet right now. And so we do have to make a vote on this. We have to, make some sort of recommendation. And if the recommendation, I'm quite certain that many people at town meeting will bring up the out of cycle nature of this. So if there is a message out of this board regarding this fund, whether it's positive, negative, or constructive, or whatever it is, I think we can leave the out of orderness aside, because I think that's already, I kind of feel like we should focus on the things that are the concerns that need to be fixed if we were to get, to a point where we're comfortable with this, or we just be clear with our votes about this is just how each member feels about this, kind of, I want to say regardless of the form, but there's some concerns that I'm not sure are ever addressable. So my takeaway is we do have to have some sort of vote, and we should be clear with the messaging on what that vote is. If you know, if there is going to be a next step, what we feel it should be. I think that's important, rather than I don't want us to walk away, but just saying no because it's the wrong time, or no because it's, you know, I feel like there should be something we can do to help set up the next step if there is one. That was all over the place. My apologies.
Any thoughts on next steps, Corey?
Well, I like that we were massaging the fund description. Obviously, I think that's something where we can add some language, where we can put some rails on this. I absolutely am certain that it will not be sufficient, to Ralph's point. But I feel like we can get some important things in there to be sure that when the town goes to vote this, if they do vote and approve it, we have put it on the best path to success, right? Whether this goes forward and this gets passed or not, it's not up to us. We're going to make a recommendation vote. So I also don't want us to sit on the sidelines and say, well, we don't like this and we're not going to even engage with it, because the town may pass it. So I think our work here is to do our best job to make it to a point where at least the language, the policy is well discussed. And if we want, if individuals, with that, we can vote at least on something that has some structure to it. That would, when the town votes it, if they vote it yes, we've inputted in a productive way. I just said the same thing twice. Sorry.
Okay. Just being cognizant of the time. I know the select board members have, I believe, their own meeting beginning in 22 minutes. So here's what I'd like to suggest. I know, starting with Michael at the very beginning of this discussion, you had questions about the mechanism. Literally, how does this work? And what I'd like to do is, you know, with Chris and the select board here, maybe spend you know, some time getting any questions you have about the mechanism answered as best they can. And if they can't answer them, then perhaps we can ask, you know, Jen to do it. I think this may be her last week, in which case we would have to schedule another meeting and have her come in specifically, or you could have a direct one-on-one conversation with her. But I'd like to spend a few minutes on that. And then to Corey's point, I'd like to go back and do what we can with this policy language and do the best we can with it, recognizing that, you know, this may come to be regardless how any one of us individually feels about it. But that would be my suggestion. And then once we lose the select board members, we can revisit anything that people would like. But I want to use the next 20 minutes of their time while we've got them.
So Brian,
Yeah.
Jean just started something in the chat, and what she wrote is the fund just gets created now, and the actual capital appropriation from the stabilization funds will be put before annual town meeting as part of a regular capital planning process.
Brian, do you want me to weigh in on just
Please.
a quick overview? So
Please.
the stabilization fund mechanisms are set by state law. The state law is set forth in the policy. We actually already have special purpose stabilization funds, including our special ed one. So we've already been administering these funds for some time previously. It's just hasn't been funded by a tax override. And so we've been doing this for years if you look at our financial policies. And you'll notice some of these, like OPEB and special ed, already have a cadence that we sync to, and we used those existing policies as the model for this one. But with the tweaks, recognizing that this is funded through the a tax increase. So just to back up, the way it works is that we initially create the fund and set the fund amount, and that requires a ballot vote and a town meeting vote, which we are going through right now. And we picked this November date for a variety of reasons, including to address, including to be able to plan for next year, including from a tax revenue purpose. Our finance director, Ms. Mullen, advised us that we needed to understand whether the fund was going to be created vis-a-vis the special election and town meeting by early December. And so that's why we chose November in order to have the fund hit for next year. In addition, the reason that we're doing it at this point is because we received a lot of feedback last year through town meeting and other sources that people wanted to see the big picture laid out, including before we went forward with other projects like the municipal buildings and the issues that kept coming up for roads and schools. And so there's a strategic reason as well. But setting that aside, in terms of the mechanics, so we create the fund, let's assume it passes at town meeting and at the ballot. We create the fund, and then every year, going forward, any appropriations from the fund have to be approved by town meeting. And so what we're proposing is that we treat the fund as another source of funding, of capital funding, and we use our typical processes, including, for example, going through advisory and capital in the select board, because this would be a warrant article, and so our town bylaws apply. And that's why I say in the chat that funding from the fund. So for example, if we say, hey, we want to spend 500,000 from the fund or 800,000, it has to be put on a warrant article for town meeting at ATM. And it would go through the same review process that we currently enjoy. In terms of setting the fund amount, the way that works is that every year the select board has to hold a hearing on that, and this is set forth in state law, has to set forth, holds a hearing and decides on the fund amount. So for example, well, not for example, the maximum that the select board can increase the fund by is 2.5%, right? Proposition 2.5. This is a tax. You can't increase it more than 2.5%. What's unique about this as compared to a permanent capital override is that the select board could zero the fund out. We could bring it to zero the next year. Let's say a select board is elected on the basis that we don't like these funds, we want to get rid of them, they could zero them out. You could also
Gene, do you want to just mention that once it's zeroed out, it can't come back? Is that where you're going?
Yeah,
next?
you would have to do a new election, a new town meeting process. And there is sort of a middle ground or middle road, so to speak, no pun intended, where you could reduce the fund from, let's say, 800 to 500. Because let's say we all of a sudden get like a huge 40R development and we put a ton of money into a fund, and then we use that all for, sidewalks and a huge catch up. And so now we're just maintenance. And we want to drop it down to like 300. 300, let's say we drop it to 300, let's say 2 years from now. 300 then becomes the new basis. And so the following year, the select board can only increase the fund by 2.5% from 300. You can't revert back to that original 800. If you drop it down, that becomes your new basis, and you can only increase it by 2.5% year over year. And so that's how the fund works. In general, and those are the mechanisms. The additional sort of hearings and requirements and inclusion of a 3 to 5 year plan, that's all extra that the select board is considering vis-a-vis the policy that you all are providing us some input on. Advisory is providing input. We'll probably get input from our lawyers, and so that's sort of where we are right now on that. But there's a lot in that policy that's just sheer state law, and that's just the way it works. And we're not going to change, obviously, the state law. So Brian, I see Mike has his hand up, but you're the chair, so I'll defer to you.
Oh yes, Mike does have his hand up. Michael, please proceed.
Hey, thanks for that, Gene. I have a question on the mechanism. If the road stabilization fund is established, does the select board have to bring each year's road plan to town meeting as a warrant article versus the way we do it now, which is the director of DPW works with the town manager to establish the road plan and fund it and get the work done? So
there's nothing in the mechanism that requires the select board to bring a specific road plan before town meeting, identifying which roads are which. The select board are the road commissioners under a separate state statute. I suppose we could all discuss whether a road plan makes sense. Candidly, I would say I don't think it does. We've already had deviations from our existing contemplated road plan for this year because we've had rain almost it's just been a really rainy year, which impacts paving. And it requires fluidity. But in any event, the short answer is no. There's nothing that requires any sort of specific list.
Okay, so I'm confused in that I think I heard you say that in order to use money from the road stabilization fund, it has to be approved by town meeting.
Yes, you would need an appropriation like the type we do right now, like 400,000 for roads and sidewalks out of this particular stabilization fund. Just like we do out of the capital stabilization fund, right? Or free cash.
Would it have to be project specific, or would it just be like we do it now, generally phrased?
I believe it would be general. It would be general.
So, Chris, I see you're having your hand raised, and I'll direct this next question to you. And maybe I don't understand the mechanism for getting the 2 miles of roads done each year. Those 2 miles of roads that DPW takes care of each year, are those placed on the warrant each time, or is that just part of the DPW operations budget section?
No, the way I think I envision it working, Mike, is, with a policy, all the discussions will have been had publicly. There'll be an amount designated matching what the expected plan is. And that'll be just part of what town meeting votes on, like it is now. There's a road line right now, right? It's part of the capital budget. So it'll just be a different funding source. Instead of the capital stabilization fund or something else, it'll say, road stabilization fund. So I think the intent is to keep it as part of the regular process, with an understanding there's a whole lot more back work that's already been done, right? But I think the mechanism would stay the same as it is. We don't need to clutter the warrant up anymore, I don't think, if we don't have to.
Okay, thanks.
Well, then, Mike, let me just weigh in on that real quick. There are other towns that put a road paving schedule out there for the next XYZ years, which the select board is trying to get to that place. And I think we're getting close. But, having never done it before, we're trying to be careful about that, because we do get tons and tons of residents wanting all different sorts of things with roads and portions of sidewalks. And Corey's smiling because he knows, but in any event.
No, I was talking to my wife, sorry.
we're aligned. All of us want a pretty reasonable and actually feasible and attainable road schedule.
You have any other questions on structure? Okay. Would people like to move back to the language to see if there's anything else we'd suggest go into the draft policy?
Let me throw out, I think what Susan has said, like what Newton has done, is that there's a termination. There's a specific termination time for that fund. I think that's the ideal thing, because most of the things we're talking about are what need to be fixed now and have been left unfixed for some period of time. But at some point, we're going to get to a stable state where, in fact, we're talking about maintenance. We're not talking about new construction like new sidewalks or catching up on roads. So you put a termination on this thing. And that way people will feel as though it's not loose at the end here, that maybe a new select board might reduce the appropriation each year, but that's just a very speculative thing to say, and nobody is going to believe that's going to happen. That is just not typical behavior on these kinds of things. The demands will be higher rather than lower than those funds can support, as I see it. So put a termination on it. That probably changes a lot for people.
Yeah, I look, I think if people want to put it as a committee, want to recommend a termination, we can recommend a termination, right? And if the select board chooses not to put in a determination, people can vote how they see fit based on, the policy as it's, as it ultimately, comes out. With regards to putting a termination in here, I mean, I just, there are two ways you can get to a termination. One is that the work goes away, okay, which I don't think is reality. And I don't think a termination prefaced on the idea that, we have to catch up and then this is going to go away is realistic. The fact is the catch-up work is getting funded by the stockpile of cash that, piled up over the course of the period of when nobody was doing any roads. And a lot of that just got executed. So, if we're, if there's going to be a termination date that goes in here, the only way that can functionally work is recognizing that you then have to make room for this in the regular way budget. And if that's what people are saying, that's fine. But I get really hesitant to, talk about a termination based on the idea that, that we're going to catch up on our deferred roads.
So Brian, maybe a mechanism where it has to be renewed to be continued, like it has to be revisited and renewed instead of a termination. Is that something that makes people more comfortable? Or
that's an interesting idea. I mean, you could put a 5-year. I'm just thinking out loud. I don't even know if it's legal, but you can certainly vote to do away with something in the future. Therefore, there's hypothetically no reason you couldn't have a vote to do away with it right now, effective 5 years from now, and force people to revisit whether or not this is actually functioning as intended.
And I think that's kind of where I end up on this. Like, I know it's not the level of feedback loop that maybe we want to see, but there is a feedback loop here. There is a check-in loop. There is a very possibility that this board could recommend against a funding, or the select board could, or town meeting could, right? There's, if we don't get the stuff we're looking for, it doesn't seem clear that we need to have this. There is, and it's small, but it's there. I think that's worth keeping in mind.
Sorry, Corey, you're saying the feedback loop that's in there now is, from your perspective, there and accurately represented, or you're suggesting that a forced revote on this?
No, I'm saying
interesting mechanism.
No, I'm saying that the feedback loop that we're looking for is built into the structure of the fund. I think just how this has to come back to town meeting every year. If it gets voted down, it can't come back up. If it doesn't get approved, it can't come back without redoing the whole thing. I think we can, in the policy, clean up the language to make it have a better chance of success and build some of those things in. But a lot of the concerns that are being expressed here are very valid, and I do think may be addressed as time goes on. I'm very sensitive to what Ralph said about no one knows what we say here, but this will come to town meeting every year, and it will never go away. So
just to be clear, mechanically, the tax does not come back to town meeting every year.
The expenditure does, and if the expenditure doesn't, if it's not expended out at town meeting, then the tax goes down.
No, the tax goes into the fund, and the money just sits in the fund.
No, but if we opt, as I believe I heard Gene correctly, if the town opts to not fund it at the level, do the transfer at town meeting, it then goes down. We have to do this every year.
No, maybe one of us will put it this way. One of us has this wrong, but my understanding, and it could entirely be me, my understanding is that the tax starts at a level. The select board decides whether it goes up, down, or stays flat. Okay. Each year after that, what goes to town meeting floor has nothing to do with the tax. It has to do with the appropriation out of the fund. So the money, the tax that we as taxpayers see and the money going into the fund is agreed once and then modified each year by the select board. The only thing that goes to town meeting is pulling money out of that fund to actually spend it on something, which is the roads. So absent, either a select board warrant article or a citizen's petition, this tax runs forever. And whether it goes up, down, or stays flat is at the discretion of the select board. And I'm just going to ask Gene or Chris to just clarify whether I've got that right or wrong.
I'm looking up the general law right
So
now.
as far as I understand, Brian, this is Chris, I think you're correct. As far as I understand, what you've just described is correct.
So let's just put a scenario where the select board doesn't make any motion and there's no warrant article on a town meeting. What happens to this fund?
The money just grows. It just so it would stay at the same level. And
So this-
it would just and
tax
the
stays the
amount
same.
and the fund would just grow. So it would just sit there unappropriated.
So the
unless
select
it's an
board doesn't have to
affirmative
take it.
act, unless it's an affirmative act, Corey, as I understand it, to raise it or lower it, it would stay the same each year. The select board doesn't have to ratify it again. The select board can make the number go up by 2.5% or go down. When it goes down, that becomes the new ceiling. You don't get to go back up again.
But
make
the
sense?
townspeople would continue to be taxed at the higher rate that was imposed when the stabilization fund becomes established. So even though and this is a hypothetical, I understand it's one use case, but if it were the case that no money would be allocated, the taxes would remain the same and the townspeople would be obliged to pay them.
Right, and the fund would grow. It would just sit. It's a stabilization fund, right? So the money would just would roll up until money was appropriated out of it.
Right, that to me seems somewhat worrisome.
So here's the language.
And this is new language that you've just added, Corey?
No, this is a Department of Revenue memo on this.
Yep.
So and how this mechanism. So this is where my understanding was coming from, which is we approve $100,000 in 2017, 2018 it's 102.50, which is 2.5, prop 2.5.
Yeah.
And then for 2019, that's raised. Only 80,000 is appropriated.
Mm-hmm.
The amount available in 2020 now becomes $82,000. It resets. So this is what I'm talking about. So if at town meeting we don't approve an appropriation, or we approve a lower appropriation, to my understanding, my reading of this, it would go down. If we don't do an appropriation.
Why is appropriated in quotes?
No idea. So it just to me, the override meets the appropriation. If the appropriation is the entire amount, then it can grow. But if the appropriation is not the entire amount, then the fund automatically reduces, unless the select board does no action, and then it basically just pauses. It freezes the 2.5%. This is back to our questions about the mechanism.
Right.
Yeah, I'm
and
looking at this last
The question
sentence.
is, what does appropriated mean? I think that.
I think it means a vote at town meeting. That's my reading of it.
Yeah.
It's appropriation is spending out of a stabilization fund. So when we talk about our appropriations, there's an appropriation,
I think it's for a town meeting appropriates that amount. I think appropriation refers to that sentence above.
Well, I think what it's trying to do is address what we've been talking about. When you get to the point where you're more in maintenance mode and the cost is less, you'll be appropriating less funds. Therefore, what you contribute to it should go down.
That's my understanding.
So
That-
here again is confusion,
Yeah.
at least on my part, on the mechanism and what's real. How much, bottom line, how much are taxpayers on the hook for in these different scenarios?
Yeah, look, I'm going to be the first to agree that my understanding, what I'm reading in front of me right now, is different from the understanding that's been my understanding based on the discussions that have taken place. And I'm looking in particular at the last sentence in the prior paragraph. The additional tax that can be appropriated for any year is limited to 102.5 of the amount when it was last appropriated. So the question is,
I'm sorry, I'll move it up that way we can keep.
yeah, there are three options. Let's just look at this. Corey, is there any way to pull the text over so that the thumbnails don't cover it? Perfect.
No,
Thank you.
well, why don't
No,
I?
you just did it. You just did it.
All
At
right,
least
okay,
on
fine.
my screen, I can see the full text now.
Yeah, I've got this.
One is Okay, I'm looking at the middle of that paragraph, that first paragraph. Like a general override, additional tax revenue can be raised year after year without a community-wide ballot question beyond the year of inception. For this kind of
Correct.
override, however, the addition to the levy can be to the levy limit can be discontinued in a future year. So that's where my understanding came from, right? Once you put it in place, it runs until you actually take action to discontinue it.
But it says,
But
you know,
down further down, you're right. The language gets confusing.
So here's where we need a finance director to walk us through this, and a finance director that has experience with this mechanism.
She's never done one. This is her first. This is her idea, but this is not something that has been
Right.
done.
So this goes to my earlier statement that we're not sure what the downsides are. We don't know.
Just hold on a second. I'm just reading this thing. Corey, can you circulate this to the team so that we can all review this
Sure.
over the coming days?
I'm also not clear about this because the 2/3 appropriation, we have a math problem there if it's only the select board, but anyway.
Well,
or
that's
if that's at town meeting.
so that's the appropriation out, right? So there's the, you know, there's the override, which creates the tax that feeds into the stabilization fund. And then there's the appropriation out of the stabilization fund.
Correct.
And that's what this language seems to refer to. There seems to be a circular reference here that says, you know, if you don't appropriate the full amount that you taxed, then the tax in the next year can only be 102.5 times the appropriation.
Or if you lower it, then that's the new ceiling.
Right.
If the amount is zero, what then?
Then this sentence applies.
Yeah.
Which is if it does come back, it can only come back at 102.5 of the last appropriation, regardless of the time that goes by.
Yeah, right.
I mean, it creates some weird circumstances. Like, let's say that, you know, for whatever reason, you know, you can't pave in a given year, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, I
You're
guess,
not funded.
I guess what you would, you know, you could appropriate and then just not execute. You've done that way. You've done the appropriation, and the money is in the individual accounts for the individual projects.
Exactly.
And the tax goes on. I guess that is fundamentally what would happen, right? We would appropriate at annual town meeting, but for whatever reason, they wouldn't spend the money. The appropriation still took place. We've got examples of that already.
Yeah, that's my understanding. And if the appropriations happen 2 or 3 years and we have $5 million sitting in there, somebody might stand up at town meeting and say, "I want my money back."
Right.
You know, that's
right. But the tax would continue on until the appropriation stopped. So there is no natural, and what one should assume that whatever is taxed is going to be appropriated at annual town meeting, right? That's the number that the select board is going to set, and there's going to be a single line item appropriation to spend that amount in that paving cycle.
But we're
Don't assume that.
won't
but,
say that
I mean,
we're guessing, but we're not on solid ground, and we do need some guidance.
Okay, so who
what-
do we get that guidance from? I mean, we can ask Jen, but Jen is ultimately not.
No,
You know,
we would, if Jen has not had experience with this, I would suggest and recommend that we speak with another town, either town manager or finance director that has used this tool and can advise us on how it works, the ins and outs, and what I keep saying, what the downsides are and what to watch out for, what to avoid.
Chris has his hand up.
Chris, thoughts?
I don't want to play the role of town council here, but I think you're losing the spirit of this for the words. The prior paragraph says that appropriation. It describes and
Chris, where am I going? I'll highlight that. Which paragraph?
The additional. I don't know if we were on the same one or not. I'm on a something from February of 2016. That's the date of this.
Okay.
But it says this. It describes that appropriation is raising the money, not spending it. We're getting hung up with the way we use the term appropriate. But in this, if you go up to the paragraph that starts with the additional levy capacity, I don't know if we're on the same thing, Corey. There's actually a DOR guideline. What does the top of this say? Yeah, I have one from 2016 that talks about the same thing. But this one describes appropriation as raising money, not spending it. So it says the additional levy capacity that could be appropriated or raised, which is this is what the select board does. It appropriates every year an amount of money. Town meeting spends it. So it's so, and because it also literally says in this that you can use this to accumulate money over time, as to like buy a fire engine. I gave that as an example. So, as I say all that, I'm most certainly happy to talk to some of my colleagues and communities that do this on a regular basis. And there's not a lot of them that have done it this way, but there are certain ones that have, since I'm going to be filling in as the finance director for the next couple of months anyway. So I will most certainly immerse myself in depth on this. That said, the most important aspects to this are that at the end of the day, the townspeople have control of this, not me, right? It's at the end of the day, town meeting controls whether or not it gets spent, and the elected select board decides whether or not the fund gets continued. And based on the policy, there'll be a lot of public conversations. But again, as I say all that, I'm happy to have a little more in depth with some of my colleagues, so I can have a more robust conversation with all of you when you'd like.
So, Chris, if the appropriation amount, it's all cyclical, right? This is, to Brian's point, it's a big circle. I think one of the concerns, if I understand it correctly, is that, yeah, we're collecting the money and the override has happened, but if we're not appropriating it, can we get certainty that the override then gets unwound? So it says that the only amount appropriated, the amount available, but it doesn't say that the override then reduces or adjusts to that amount. So I think does the collection of the money stop if the appropriation stops automatically?
So I'm just trying to dissect this. I'm looking at the first paragraph. If you look at the about the third line there, it says, source from within the levy or from other. Oh, sorry, second line. So, okay, it's the first three lines, but the second line, traditional appropriation presented either as a budget line. So this is how you raise the funds, right? There are three options for raising the funds or building up the balance in the special purpose stabilization fund. One is as a traditional appropriation. So that's funding into the space stabilization fund, right? It's presented as a budget line item or a separate article, sourced from within the levy or from other general fund revenues, such as transfer of funds from another account, right? So that's an appropriation. It's an appropriation out of, out of the general levy, okay? The second funding option, which is the one we're using here, is not characterized as an appropriation. The second funding option is a unique type of Prop 2.5 override. So they're not referring to this mechanism that we're using as an appropriation, because it's not an appropriation, right? It's not coming out of some source of funds. It's a tax. And so, when they get down to the third paragraph here, and start talking about appropriations, the raising of the tax, I don't think actually is an appropriation. So if given we funded this with a tax and not through an appropriation out of the budget, then this appropriation language in paragraph 3 gets very weird, because the funding mechanism, the funding source is not an appropriation, it's a tax.
Right.
And then this language here that basically says, you're capped at whatever you 102.5 times your last appropriation, which in our case would be an appropriation out of this fund.
But Brian, I wonder if this here, I mean, the mechanism to continue or lower or defer it solely through an appropriation vote. So this is, I think, what links those two things, right? The appropriation vote is the only mechanism that allows the community to continue the override. Okay. Mike?
No, so if I'm reading this correctly, in each succeeding year after a community has approved a stabilization fund override, the select board, city council, or town council can continue the additional tax earmarked for the fund, or may lower it, defer it, or resume a prior deferral solely through an annual 2/3 vote. I'm not sure the 2/3 vote applies to the continuance. I mean, it's interesting. It's an interestingly placed modifier.
I mean, it says continue. I mean,
Yeah.
it says continue here. I mean, that's
Yeah.
And then the question is, everywhere else it refers to town meeting for the appropriation.
Yeah.
This is the only sentence where it says select board.
Yeah.
And 2/3, but that still doesn't. It still has to go back to town meeting. So that's confusing.
So we literally, as we read this, we're perplexed as to whether or not it actually has to come back to town meeting every year for the tax piece of this. Is that the consensus as we read this?
The language seems to have some conflicting language in it in this paragraph versus the others.
And don't we have application? I think, Chris, we have an application anyway where we have something similar. What do we do with that one?
They might be on their meeting.
We don't have anything like this. I mean,
What was the special needs one?
oh, the special it's a different. It's funded differently, but the school special education stabilization fund, money goes into that. The money is only appropriated, into that by town meeting. It can be spent, though. It's kind of backwards. Town meeting has to put the money in, but it's the select board and school committee they get to spend it by each voting pursuant to parameters that the town has established. But I've just checked again. There's 18 municipalities around the state that are using this or have tried to use this fund. A number of them have active accounts, and I could look and see that there's one vote. There was one public vote, and that year to year, it can increase if they. I can see that a number of the numbers have increased in almost all of these where the fund is still active by that 2.5% number, But again, I'm happy to contact my counterparts in some of these communities, which include, Orleans is one that's done this a lot.
And Chris, can you see or not see whether or not there are subsequent votes in each subsequent year?
No. So there's no subsequent public vote. So I'm looking at the DOR website where it actually says it repeats so it only gets voted on by the public once. All right.
Yep.
So unless you're going to repeal it, I guess you got to have a proposition repeal vote too. I mean, but that doesn't show up on these. So there's only one public vote, and after that, it's the select board or the governing body, in this case, the select board, and then town meeting allocates the funds like it does normally, right? Because you can't take money out of a stabilization fund without town meeting vote.
So
2/3 of town meeting, actually.
Right.
So
this is town of Medfield. They have a municipal buildings capital stabilization fund grading under blah 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 blah. And this is kind of how they handle it.
Right. So those are amounts coming out. It's not the appropriation coming in. Hold on. Yeah. So subsequent override of $1 million, which increases by 2.5% each year with the approval of the Board of Selectmen, provides the dedicated revenue for this stabilization fund. So these are the appropriations coming out.
Yeah.
It's a classic capital expenditure. I mean, you got duct cleaning in this thing. I mean,
Yeah. It is. I mean, this is the what. So we need clarification on this, but this gets back to what my understanding was in the first place, what Chris just articulated, what this suggests, which is, the tax is voted once. Select board then controls whether it goes, up, down, or sideways, max of up 2.5% in any given year. Okay. And town meeting votes on what comes out of how that money gets used. But the tax itself goes on to, sort of cruise control with the, with select board at the wheel.
Well, unless the appropriation has that feedback loop, which is, I think, where we're stuck, right, Brian? I mean, that's,
This language is the language you just highlighted is wacky. I mean, I guess where it would trigger a decline, or one might argue it would trigger a decline, is if, okay, the tax is on cruise control, so the tax happens, and for whatever reason there was not an appropriation to roads that year, right? Then there's no appropriation anywhere. And that language could come into play hypothetically, I guess.
or if they appropriated $200,000.
Yeah.
That. Sorry, Mike, I've been holding the floor.
Sorry, Mike, I missed your hand. Go ahead, please.
All right. I have a suggestion here. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with agile management, but the concept of agile is to start with a proof of concept and go into a pilot and continually iterate and reiterate a new process, learning as you go, trying things. Some things work, some things don't, learning from those experiences and adjusting and modifying and evolving your new process. I would suggest at this point that we treat this concept similarly, and that we get a proof of concept from Chris Senior's contacts. Does it work? What questions, what learnings did the other towns come away with? Then we as a town pilot a special purpose stabilization fund for one fund till we learn how it works. And I just note it here, pilot this special purpose stabilization fund for roads at the level of $300,000. So then now we're not risking that larger tax increase. If we're going to hit the folks for tax increase, let's limit that tax increase while we figure this out, because that's what we're doing. We're figuring it out. And then once we've made our learnings from our pilot, then we can, well, whatever the learnings are, maybe we increase it. Maybe we walk away from this and say, you know what? It has more difficulty than we really want to deal with. But the only way to get there is to do a proof of concept and to pilot it, on a limited basis, to limit our risk and to limit how much money we're asking our town people to pull out of their pockets, and not have to throw it away and say, gee, sorry, it didn't work the way we thought, and we're going to cut the tax increase, but sorry about the money you already had to contribute. That to me is onerous. The other thought I have, as we talked about sunset and how long and so on, my suggestion is to start this fund in the future, not on this warrant. Either I put in my notes 1 year from now, but some people may object. Let's say at an annual town meeting, we start the fund 6 months out or a year out, and then sunset the fund in 3 years and learn across those 3 years And then, yes, come back to the town for a new vote. Because we're learning. This is not something many people understand. And just listening, Brian and Corey, I'm so impressed with the way your minds are working and trying to figure it out. And it's a great exercise, but man, it's only an exercise right now. And we're talking about large tax increases. I know there's pressure from the schools to get the maintenance done, but are we really ready to commit that kind of money if we're not even sure how it all works, how it's supposed to work? And we should not be learning as we go when you're asking people to pony up out of their own funds, whether you're making a lot of money or whether you're on a fixed income. It's just money that we cannot say is being well spent. We just don't know yet.
I have a couple of thoughts. The first is I think it's important to separate the money and how it's going to be spent from our lack of understanding of the structure for a moment. No matter what the amount of money is going to the roads and sidewalks, that's the only place it can go. And what got us here in the first place is that the $300,000 a year is not enough. And the $800,000 a year that, you know, others have reached as a consensus right amount or correct amount, you know, it cannot be funded out of the capital stabilization fund. I mean, that's how we got here in the first place. 300 isn't enough. The capital stabilization funding as a mechanism to fund the correct amount, which is apparently $800,000, you know, is not an option. And this is the proposed solution. So I'm not just individually, personally, I share your concern with regards to our sort of neophyte understanding of this structure. I'm not concerned about where the money's going. I know where the money's going. And I guess what I'm wrestling with is, you know, our I'm just going to loosely say obligation to figure this structure, do our best to figure this structure out, as opposed to running from it. And if the concept of a pilot is interesting, let's shift back to the structure and put the money aside and where it's going. Concept of pilot is interesting. I mean, if the thing doesn't function, you know, we should have a forced mechanism or a voluntary mechanism to make it go away. The question is whether or not the town meeting vote, you know, to make it go away, which is always an option, is sufficient for people, or whether they want to force a revote on this after sort of a trial and an audit period, which is an interesting concept. If we do, you know, if hypothetically we went down the path of a trial and an audit, you know, a pilot and an audit and a revote, that pilot needs to last long enough to actually matter and give us information on whether or not, you know, we want to continue. I'm just thinking out loud here, but, you know, the taxes for next year, which would fund the summer of 25. So the reason this is coming now largely is because for the summer of 24 paving plan,
correct,
you know, these taxes need to show up in people's taxes bills, you know, starting in Q3 and Q4, in order for there to be money in the fund to actually pave next summer. Like that's what's driving the timing. So if this doesn't happen, then that money has to come from somewhere else, whether it be free cash or capital stabilization or some combination of both, or you underfund it at 300 and allow yourself to, you know, willfully fall behind by 50% of what we should pave next summer. So I'm just thinking in terms of a pilot. In order for that to actually work, you need to put it in place, execute on it, see whether it works over, you know, a cycle or two, and then still be able to make a decision prior to when the tax rate would be, you know, set at whatever point in time you'd either want to continue or discontinue. So my instinct is that, you know, you're looking at least 2 or 3 years of doing this before you could really say, okay, this is working exactly as we intended. Or know that it's not.
Or learn from it. I mean, the point of the pilot is to learn from it. And you set up a pilot very tightly, very small. It's called a minimum viable product. You come up with what is the minimum process or minimum outcome that will help demonstrate that this works. And then you constantly are testing it. You're constantly trying it and finding the faults and finding the weaknesses and finding the strengths and continue, as I used the term before, you're evolving.
Yeah. I'm philosophically indifferent as to whether it's large or small. The bottom line is we have to spend 800 grand on roads next summer. So whether we put $1 in this fund and do, you know, or $1,000 in this fund and 799,000 out of capital stabilization or vice versa, it doesn't matter to me. But
yeah, but it does matter because it's a tax increase. So if you do take it out of the levy, then you're not exposing. Look, we can have the conversation with the town administration, but we're being told they're not taking it out of the levy. It's kind of that simple. It's an interesting philosophical discussion, but that's what we're being told. So,
well, and the residents may vote that we'd like the roads are fine and we'd rather keep our money, or they'll vote, you know, we'd rather see that that's what this is for. One question, I'm still reading. I found the full text of the stabilization fund. I'll distribute it to everybody. In Cohasset, because it references the local appropriating authority. So as I understand it, the only appropriating authority in Cohasset is town meeting, right? So select board can choose what the appropriations are, but the appropriations have to occur through the appropriating authority, which is town meeting, based on
that's the money coming out.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just saying, if we're not voting on the money coming out, you know, we're back to that. So as for the size, so it strikes me that I think we're all under the impression that, Mike, I won't speak for anybody else. It felt like the amount of work that the schools needed was a certainty, multi-year funding. We're actually quite behind on that. So if there was a quote unquote pilot, I think we can clearly put $5 million of projects, you know, that were highlighted right in front of us. I'm not sure the roads funds has that same level of catch-up necessity. So if we were value agnostic, but we were just looking for a pilot program to meet a need, the schools, I think we've got the clearest understanding of the gap between the need and the funds available. So just for the purposes of that academic argument.
You know, you mentioned schools, Corey, and it just sparked a thought in my head. You know, this, if we're reading this correctly, and the levy's not an appropriation, and next year's appropriation can only be 102.5% of this year's appropriation. In the case of the schools, the idea that we could raise this tax year after year after year, allow it to build up in the fund and not appropriate out of the fund, may not work at all. I mean, it may legally not work.
I bet you can appropriate it to, I think if you appropriate to an account, that's what you said earlier, right, Brian? I mean, you could say transfer out of this part of the override into the, you know, fund. I'd feel a
lot more comfortable transferring it to roads and sidewalk expenditure for, you know, for the summer of 2024 paving plan, right? And have the conversation with Brian about what those 3 or 4 roads are going to be. You know, that's one thing. You know, appropriating $1.5 million out of the stabilization fund to the schools for undefined
or to a fund, right? Yeah, exactly right.
Well, yeah. I mean, for something that's completely undefined, I mean, that's a little frightening, because now you've literally just taken all the governance off of it. Right.
That was my question to Ms. Healy-Dippold, which is, you know, are they imagining that the appropriations are specific projects, or are they general appropriations into a fund for general purposes? And she said second.
the discussion that, at least every discussion I've had regarding the schools, is that the appropriations out of that fund are supposed to look, as Ralph pointed out in the case of this other town that you pulled up, Corey,
Just like that.
they look exactly like any other capital appropriation. They're specific line item requests with dollar amounts next to them.
Well, so we could appropriate it to roofs and not use that, right?
Good, I guess.
Back to the questions about this mechanism, which is what I put up 8 months ago.
I mean,
at my previous seat, which is
I guess, but I don't think the roof is the first thing they intend to. And Michael's point's spot on, that we still have work to do to understand these mechanisms, and frankly, the town still has work to do to understand these mechanisms.
Yeah, so I'm reading a release right from the state of Massachusetts, and a couple of things of interest pop up, and that is that you can change what the fund is used for with a 2/3 vote of your legislative body. So that would be our select board. But it also says, Mike,
Can you repeat that? You can change what it can be used for.
Yeah.
With a vote of your select board?
2/3 vote, yeah.
Is this what you found, Susan? This one?
Yeah.
Okay,
But
what page are you on?
it also says further down, oh, you want to talk about that one first? That is.
Just
It's
directly.
page 2, where you do creation of the funds and then appropriation transfers. And the next section.
Gotcha.
It says dedication and revenue stream to the fund, which is section 2C. Wait a minute, I lost it, sorry. Let me find it again.
There you go. I got it.
Yeah, so you can change what it's going to be used for, but the other thing that's interesting, to Michael's point about creating a pilot, is you can't make the fund, you can't vote to have the fund go away unless you've had it in place for 3 years. So you have to give it at least 3 years.
Is that just for a dedicated revenue stream? Like you're saying, okay, we're going to take a restaurant tax and dedicate it to this special stabilization fund, right? That's how I think about a dedicated revenue source, but.
Yeah, so they use this word acceptance. So acceptance is you're accepting the creation of this dedicated stabilization fund. Then you can revoke the acceptance, but only after 3 years. The fund has been in.
I see that, but I'm just, my question, we're gonna have to read this separately. We can't, but I'm looking at the prior paragraph where it's talking about funds that are set up, using a dedicated revenue source. So that's different than an override. Like a dedicated revenue source is taking a specific tax line. Like it could be our automobile excise tax or something like, well, I'm not sure we even get that. The state may get that, but I don't know. It could be our parking tickets, right? We're going to take all of our parking tickets and that's our dedicated, revenue source for the stabilization fund. That's how I'm reading this. I'm not sure that this 3-year lockdown would apply to a stabilization fund that's set up with an override or funded with an override.
Yeah, well, we can all read it.
We're gonna have to figure this out.
All the examples do use the Prop 2.5.
Oh, do they? Okay.
Below.
You say below, Susan?
Yeah, there are examples down below, and it's exactly the example that we're looking at on Medfield site. So
Yeah.
they took it right out of here.
What's the timer?
Appropriation into, right, so out of the levy into a stabilization fund. Yeah.
Right, that's an appropriation because you already have the money.
Correct. We already saw this language earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Example.
feels like we have some more research to do on this, and we're ultimately going to have to come up with very specific structure questions and present them to someone that can answer them for us. And do the best we can to learn more about this thing to the point where we at least understand the structure and can draft policy that, you know, makes the best of the structure or functions within the context of the structure and everyone's intent. And then, you know, I'm not forgetting, but I'm putting off to the side from those two exercises the very real reality that I think that, you know, there are a range of opinions as to whether or not we should be doing this at all. Mike, you're on mute.
No, I'm sorry. What do you mean by doing this at all?
Should
By doing a special purpose tax override at all.
Oh, yes, right. Yeah.
I you know, when I'm talking about learning about the structure and writing the policy, I don't want to be, I just want to be clear. I'm not ignoring or not listening to the fact that one or more people or all may come down with the view that we shouldn't be doing this at all. But I think we still have an obligation as a committee and frankly as a town to learn about this structure and write the best policy we can within the context of the mechanism, and then vote it as we see fit. I'm not really sure what else to do, but I'm open to thoughts and suggestions.
I mean, I think that any of the questions that we had here tonight should be questions that we, at least in this committee, should be able to easily answer with, and our vote should reflect that understanding.
Yes.
And whether it's positive or negative on whether we should be doing this or not, it should come with the understanding fully of this mechanism. So
Agreed.
I don't know how we can vote if we don't have the ability to explain to residents what the vote means in either direction.
You haven't seen me poll tonight as to whether or not people have what they need to vote. I think the answer to that is self-evident. But I can if people would like. But I'm more focused on, okay, what do we do next? And it feels like we need to review these documents that Corey and Susan have found, and any others that we might be able to find to learn more about this. And then we need to have a conversation either with the Department of Revenue directly, which you know we can do that, or have town council. But I'm not even sure necessarily town council is going to be expert on this.
Right.
The other problem is that a lot of these ships have sailed. I mean, there's, you know, I said this months ago, but and not in this forum, but like, you know, if there's needs, maybe we can just do a couple one-time capital raises for whatever we need to get done for next year while we figure out this language. You know, I'm very sensitive to, Brian, your point, which is next year we're going to need $800,000 of money to do just what we're doing today, right? So, you know, that train is coming down the tracks regardless of what we understand or not. So, you know, there's a high level of discomfort that I'm feeling with trying to square needing to know what we need to know, understanding the mechanism, but also how do we deal with things that we need to get done. That's an uncomfortable position.
Just a thought crossed my mind. I almost fear the answer, but where is advisory on this? Why did they approve it so easily? Do they just trust that this will all work out in the end? But they approved it unanimously, and it's surprising to me that they were not asking the same questions that we're raising.
I can't.
I don't think we can speak to that.
I don't think there's anyone here that can speak for advisory. It's an interesting, you know.
If any of you had any conversations, say with Rob or Mike Barclay or Diane Kennedy, for example.
All I can say is that watching their meetings, there was a focus on the need, right? That I think their perspective, and I don't want to speak for them, but it felt like their votes were coming from a recognition of the need, which I think we all, you know, can see as well.
Yeah, I mean, in fairness, we're not having any discussion about the need, right? Because I mean, we can have one, but I think everyone's already past that. We're now on to like, okay, how do we meet that need? And if it's in the context of this mechanism, we need to understand the mechanism. We need to write policy that works. If that need is met through the levy, and we, then so be it. People need to make room for it.
Right.
Just a quick sort of data point with regard to the roads. I might have sent you, Brian, the actual calculation of the available funding for roads, which had been presented to us, I think, in March or April of this year.
Yeah.
It was 1.2 million.
Yep.
Okay.
And I don't think we received our Chapter 90 yet, so it was going to be, closer to 1.5 by the time it was all.
Okay.
Oh, wait a minute. So
I don't think so.
Sorry, Ralph. So you said that was May or April?
March or April, yeah, right.
Okay, so it was before annual town meeting, so there should be another 500 on top of that.
There should be another 500 on top of that. And what was the spending? We know Elm Street was about 750. We know that Church Street was a grant. I can't tell you the others. So the question is, what's really remaining in the fund that is not going to be spent this year? And what will be added, assuming we have the same practice we've always had, which is 300,000 out of the capital stabilization and an expectation of about 220,000 out of Chapter 90. So you might actually find out that you've got $700,000, $800,000 anyway available. So you have to be careful about the numbers here. What's really needed? I think the big weakness in all of this is still the sidewalks. That there may well be enough money for the roads themselves. For example, Pond Street, where it extends from 3A back to the high school, that's going to be done on the money they're getting from National Grid, for example. So the question is, what is it, in fact, we're going to do? And the road plan is in flux, but what is necessary for next year to be very specific about these things and say, do we or don't we have the money? Rather than making any recommendations, I just feel that the lack of facts really, really bothers me about this, the specificity about what we actually need the money for. And that also applies to the schools. And, when you look back and you say, what have we provided as a capital budget committee for the schools? Heck, we provided something over $1 million in 2021, another $500,000 last year. I mean, we put in a lot of money into the schools, into everything they wanted, except maybe the signboards and maybe the paving of the road going up to the schools. We have been funding everything they've asked for. So the question really is, what is needed, rather than trying to figure this out as, well, we need $1.5 million a year indefinitely for the schools and $800,000 indefinitely for roads and sidewalks. It feels too loose and unspecific about what it actually applies to and whether those are the right numbers or that's the right mechanism even. This is really not thought through very well, to be perfectly honest with you. So.
Brian, Chris has his hand raised, and I also see that Chief Quigley has been in the audience since we started.
Oh, interesting.
Okay. I don't know if the chief is looking for us to answer any questions he might have for the questions that we had last week. So I just want to point that out. I certainly want to be respectful of the chief's time.
I agree. Why don't we just quickly ask Bill if there's something specific he wants to discuss, because I think we can. We're also close to wrapping up.
Yeah.
I don't know if Michelle, you can promote Bill or just.
Is talking permitted for?
Yeah, Chief Quigley, you're on mute, but we just wanted to know if there was anything in particular that might fall under the items not anticipated 48 hours in advance of this meeting.
No, not at all. I'm just watching for situational awareness with the roads and sidewalks. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Oh.
All right, Chris, you've got your hand up.
But I just wanted to say that, I mean, I can't define anyone's individual concept of what enough is, but Brian Joyce has presented extensively with a plan that's obviously adaptable for roads paving for the next 5. I think it's at least 5 years, if not 10. That's been publicly presented. I think you all have that. And there's a plan just like that for schools that lists a whole lot of projects that Nick Berardi. In fact, did Nick spend a ton of time with you folks about this? I mean, I don't know that he could do anything more than actually like lead you through the projects one by one. I mean, so I mean, you can ask for more. I don't know what else that, you know, and again, I'm not questioning if you want, but I'm telling you that unless I've missed something, and I apologize if I have, there's been a fairly extensive amount of material given to you folks about what this is at least for the next couple of years, would be spent on. And you know, I don't know that if there's something missing, just let me know and I'll see what I can provide.
I think the one thing that I've heard tonight, Chris, that's definitely missing is, you know, we'd like to know what the balances are in the road funds, and how that compares to what we need to spend next summer. With regards to the schools, I don't think there's, I mean, unless people feel differently, I don't think there's anything else Nick needs to provide me, at least, to evidence the fact that
that's exactly what we've been asking the schools for a very long time. I think the question, Chris, more than anything, and the committee, my colleagues, is at 1.5 million. Let me rephrase that. Can we slow down the spending? Can we go to a 1.0 million, knowing that we've got a lengthy list to get through? It's just a question that's still in my mind. I think the way we arrived at the calculation of 800,000 makes a lot of sense. I don't get the same feeling on how we arrived at the 1.5 million for the schools. So there's my concern. Not that they have not prepared excellent work in justifying the need. The need is well articulated.
Yeah, they could go either way. They go up or down. But now we're stuck in the need and we're off the mechanisms. So
we are, and we're not onto the school item, but we can certainly touch on it briefly before we wrap up this meeting. The question is, what is our next steps with regards to this mechanism? That's or next steps, period, between now and special town meeting. I mean, I would start with the mechanism. I think we need to go back and we need to iron this out. We need to understand it. And to the extent that our understanding, you know, shows something different from what everyone else is assuming on this, you know, we would need to bring other committees up to speed. Hopefully it's just a confirmation exercise, but clearly it hasn't been done.
Is it appropriate for us to invite someone from DOR, or does DOR typically not come to Capital, you know?
Any thoughts, Chris?
You're never going to get a state representative from a agency that works 9 to 5 to an evening meeting. We can't get the MSBA to do
that. No, I understand that. We're not limited to an evening meeting. I mean,
that said, I can see if there's other materials they can do, or if there's training perhaps on this that they've done before. I can ask. They generally don't. I mean, there's 351 cities and towns, right? They generally, as a rule, don't go to like brief committees on items like this, but I can ask.
We're looking for subject matter experts. So whether it's DOR or other towns, we're looking for subject matter experts to help us with our discovery, to help us understand the mechanisms. We're research. Discovery equals research. We're trying to research this. So whoever can help us as experts on it is what we need. And we can even
suggestions, Chris. I mean, you clearly understand that we're focused on items in here that nobody can answer. So the work is not done. Who can we go to as a subject expert to get to the bottom of the questions that we have on this mechanism?
So you're talking. Let me just make sure I understand this. You're talking about how a special purpose stabilization fund funded through a debt exclusion vote.
It's not a debt exclusion; it's an override.
Well, I'm sorry. Through a public vote to keep outside of the limits of Prop 2.5. How it works. I will go back and check again. And if you want a live body, I will see what I can find for someone who can answer questions that I mean,
if I could narrow it down,
I think it's very easy to fall into a rabbit hole on these things, because I don't think they're as complicated as they're being made out to be. At the same time, I will readily admit I've not operated one of these before.
Yeah.
But I will.
A rabbit hole is definitely.
I will get you something as soon as I can. If I can get a live body, that's the best thing.
I would agree with that. And I agree this may be a rabbit hole. It could also be a cliff. I mean, if Susan's right, and a select board can decide to repurpose this tax,
it can't. I don't want to be town council here, but I am an attorney.
Right.
I've been doing this for a decade. The select.
You muted yourself, Chris.
You just muted, Chris.
Sorry, the dog jumped on me at the same time as I was trying to talk. I'm glad I fed her. I should be gnawing on my leg. So the select board cannot repurpose a stabilization fund. It cannot. Town meeting potentially can, but the legislative body, by the way, the legislative body in town is not the select board. It's town meeting. Town meeting is a legislative body. The select board is the executive body. And I don't want to get too hung up on the structure of government here. That said, stabilization funds cannot be repurposed. As I understand it, they cannot be repurposed by any other entity except the town meeting when that's even possible. I think there's some funds that are not repurposable, but I'm not going to get into the details of that. But does that answer your question on that? I mean, and I'm pretty confident that I'm right on that.
Well, can you just, if we can get somebody to pepper with these things, I mean, again, these things should be easy to answer. And if we can get so much of the concerns, I think in this meeting was, yeah, what happens 2-3 years, if this is a leap of faith, because of some answers, some questions not being answered, do we have the confidence that there's a mechanism that the people can adjust and keep accountability here? So if we can just get somebody to pepper those, I mean, they're just, it's like playing racquetball here. We just want to pepper them with questions when it comes to what about year 2, what about year 3, and just get, clear, back, yes, no, this is the mechanism. I think that would go a long way. And if we can get to the point where we say, yeah, there's a lot of things going down the road where we're able to redirect this, I think that makes a lot of things a lot easier and it will be really valuable to the town.
It would be helpful.
I will remind you that the ultimate reset in a democracy is elections. So, and in New England, it's town meeting, right? So the voters can express their will en masse, right, at a public meeting on the budget and on financial and operational items. That said, I don't want to get 1776 on us here. So
no, look, it would be nice to set it up the right way and make sure we all understand how it works. And I think, Chris, I mean, I certainly hear your frustration. I think the reality is that, every single one of us and every single board, as well as in the town administration, has never done this before. So there's just no amount of conversation that's going to, I think, create a quintessential level of comfort. I think there are questions here that are, and even as you're answering questions, you're caveating it by saying, but I'm not certain, right? And we need to get past that.
So I'm an attorney. I am never gonna I'm never gonna tell you flat out absolutely. I'm sorry, that's in my genetic code. I can't fix it.
I mean, it's mass law, and we're asking people to sign up for a tax. We have to be able to tell them how it works.
You got it. Right. Let me offer this thought. What we're looking to do, Chris, is I use the word game model. What we'd like to do is take an example, call it a hypothetical, but take one of our funds and with someone who has experience with this, I'm taking off of what you just said, Brian. What happens in year 1? What happens in year 2? What are some of the issues that might arise between years 1 and 2, and adjustments are made? That could be very helpful to just sort of walk slowly in a tabletop type exercise where we're trying to step through what could happen and how things happen. So I certainly can make myself available during 9 to 5 as part of a research team or a working group made up of our folks and perhaps even folks from advisory, if not select board, to really try and understand how this works.
I can as well. What I'd suggest is Susan, Michael, if you can circulate, Corey, circulate the documents that you found. We should all read them. And if there's anything else anyone has seen, we should read that too. And create a list of really surgically direct questions, not philosophical questions, but structural questions You know, line X says this, what happens if? And then let's create that list, and then let's get on the phone with the DOR and ask them. I mean,
Right.
somebody's got to be able to tell us.
Agreed.
I don't know how else to give people comfort. And certainly, Chris, if there's another town that is willing to talk to us that's done it, that would go a long way. I know when we set up OPEB, we talked to Ted, whatever his name was, from Hingham, and I mean, it was incredibly helpful.
No, I hear you, and I'm looking at as we're talking here. There's two managers that I believe I know them both, that have done this enough that I think if I can get one or the other of them to give us a little time, I'll see if I can set something up, because I think that one of them has been doing it for a really long time. So if I can get her, it's even better.
Okay,
great.
And folks, we need to remember, if Chris is able to get us someone from another town, we need to be really respectful of their time. We need to come prepared, be really surgical with our questions.
Agreed. That's how to do it right.
Looks like Hingham also passed one last year.
Is it an evergreen? It's a perpetual?
Yeah, creation of a special stabilization fund to help alleviate some of the. I'll keep researching this. I just found the one.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. We're way over our 7:30 targeted stop time.
Can we set up next set of meetings, the next 2 meetings at least, if not however many are left, whether it's Monday nights before town meeting?
Well, we should certainly, yeah. So the answer is yes. Let's do that. First of all, is everybody available the next 2 Monday nights?
Yes.
Okay. Same time, same place. 5:30 to 7:30. Is that the best time?
Yeah, that's fine.
When are we getting home from New York, honey? Okay, that's fine.
That works. Okay, so let's certainly plan for the next several the Monday nights remaining between now and town meeting, which I think there are 2 of them, right?
30th and the 6th.
Yeah, 30th and the 6th. And then the question is, is that enough time to get through this, or do we need additional meetings?
Most likely, we probably need more, I would guess, just given the depth that we've gone to tonight with our questions. It seems like we've got plenty to parse through, and
yeah. Once we get through the fund structure, it applies to both, and the policies will roll right out. I think once we actually really have confidence how these things work, so that should be. Is next Monday early enough to meet, or do we think we could actually get real? I mean, if Chris is able to source somebody, we should do that, as quickly as possible. Do people feel like they want to meet before next Monday? I mean, the earliest we can do is I can post tomorrow for a Thursday.
Is there anything to discuss on Thursday that we have enough information to actually have a conversation, discussion, vote?
Have you had an opportunity to vote on the town hall project yet?
No.
Do you think you'll have enough information Thursday to vote on that? Tomorrow night is the Affordable Housing Trust joint meeting with the select board. So if you
That's a very
into that,
good suggestion. I certainly want to attend that meeting virtually and learn more about affordable housing's contribution, not only financially but also programmatically. Their role.
Michelle, there were a handful of items on that project that we had listed as follow-up items. I think Jean took away the list. If we made, and I don't have it in front of me, but I could probably put my hands on it. Have we made any progress on those items?
I think we have responses to all of the questions. I'll have to look through the list again. If you can set eyes on it, I can definitely get you all those answers in the morning, but tomorrow evening during the select board meeting, a representative is going to be there to speak to the committees about the lottery system, workforce housing, and local preference.
Good. Good.
So do people feel like they want to meet Thursday and hit that?
I'm
I
willing.
would rather not. I don't want to ping pong issues. Just I feel like if we can just focus on these, we stated a lot of the need is
Okay.
we understand it, and we are stuck on the mechanism. So I want to focus on the mechanism for this, and then we can get these off, and then with clear head, tackle that because it's a $10 million project. So I'm not going to be able to shift my brain between the two because I'm going to spend time reading what Susan just sent out. I'm going to put my time and effort into understanding these funds better. If I try to do two things, I'll do neither. So
Okay, that's fair. More than fair.
Why don't we try to take in what we can tomorrow? And for those of us that are trying to keep all these trains running, Michelle, we'll follow up on those outstanding items, make sure we've got progress on those, and then we'll get, once we're comfortable that we've got all that stuff, we'll get town meeting back on the agenda. We also have the issue of the school feasibility study, which I can't see the list of attendees. Is there anyone on from the school?
it's just Chris and Chief
Yeah,
Cooley right now.
that's what I thought. So there's no point in discussing that this evening. They have a list of questions which are not receiving a response at this point. So we'll put that back on the agenda when there's a response.
On the public safety meeting, the last meeting, I expressed some unease with the lump sum that we had encountered, the 6 million, which is exclusive of a $2 million contingency, which is contingency is basically a third, right? I mean, the building is the building, but if the remaining 8 is split, 6 and 2, 2 million is 1/3 of 6. So it would be very helpful to have a better idea of how the 6 million is being used for the Sally Port, for the holding rooms, and so on, to build out the elevator. And
I should be able to get you some numbers. They're going to be high level in opinions of value at this point, but we should be able to get you something.
Okay, and then whether or not that contingency can come down. So my goal is to reduce the amount of tax increase by being really precise on how much we really need to ask for. But
Mike, what's your concern with that? Is it that it's going to go over? Is it going to come under? And
my concern is that we may be asking for a tax increase that could be lower.
There's two things about that, right? With the debt exclusion, if the construction's done and it comes in under budget, right? It doesn't, you're not gonna tax for money you didn't spend. But that being said, if we're budgeted for X, to Ralph's point earlier, I think, it's fair to assume that'll probably meet that.
Okay.
So,
Michael, I'm just seizing on Michelle's words that, the numbers at this point are going to be high level and they're just going to be opinions. I'm also sensitive to, what you're saying, which makes perfect sense, which is we don't want to, sign up to spend any more than we need to, or tax people any more than they want to be, are willing to be taxed. But if we're really dealing with extremely high level numbers and opinions at this point, it's dangerous to cut into the contingency until those numbers are actually, bid numbers. It creates a situation where we, appropriate a lower number at special town meeting and risk having to come back with a or increase the risk of having to come back and ask for more.
That's true with any number, right, Brian? I mean,
it's true with that's Corey, you're absolutely right. I mean, we saw this with town hall, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it was
10 could be 11,
$18 million project, and then it went out to bid, and then it was a $24 million project. So I don't know. I mean, you're right. It's a risk with any number, but I mean,
I think we're signing on for the cost of that project. I don't want to say whatever it is, but
yeah,
it's somewhat whatever it is.
There's some truth to that. It's not a particularly comforting thought, but there's some truth to that. But anyway, whatever numbers you can come back with would be helpful, and then we can think about what they tell us, if anything.
Thank you.
We also have the CPA funding for Harborview.
Yeah,
is that something we wanted to try to?
It's not something we're going to touch on tonight unless it's someone here from that committee, and it's not my understanding that there's not. So
okay.
I think there's still an open question there. I need to get to the bottom of who actually owns it. I think you're right, Corey. The town ultimately owns it, which means it's a capital budget review under the bylaw. But I'll confirm that, and then we'll make sure that somebody is here the next time we put it on the agenda.
Again, I'm not going to play tenant council here. I'm sorry to jump in. The Housing Authority is an independent agency. It has an elected board that's separate from the towns, and it has a separate legal existence. If you read the actual state law, which I have done, it sets up all of these as independent entities. They can be sued independently. They have liabilities independently. They are in the towns that they exist in. And they were created by town meeting initially. That said, they are independent entities. So they're town in the sense they're in the town, right? But they're not, the town doesn't control them. So you can still, if you want to call them in, you're free to.
The question is,
they're not town like Public Works or police are.
I guess the question, Chris, is it fundamentally a town-owned asset? Because my understanding is that the town is the sole shareholder of the trust that holds the building.
No, that's that is. I don't think that's remote. You're talking about you're talking about the housing authority. The housing authority is not owned by the town. The housing authority is a separate legal entity, and it's.
I understand.
What about Harborview, the actual facility?
The actual facility would be
who's the deed
owned
under?
That would be owned by the housing authority, which is a separate legal entity. So the town has. It doesn't show up on the town's books. We don't report its liability. It's not part of the town from a legal or financial point of view. It's not part of the town's balance sheet to be. I don't want to deep dive into all the legalities of what happens if the housing authority disappears. But it as I understand it, it has an independent legal significance. Now, again, if you want to call them in, you're free to. I'm not suggesting you can't ask them, but I don't think that they are a town-owned asset.
I don't have a fundamental desire to pull them in any direction. But I would like to ultimately understand who, at the end of the day, owns the asset. And if it's a town asset, it's pretty clear.
Right. How can CPC allocate money to something that is not part of the town?
Well, they can, and they do.
Yeah, Mike, they're legally allowed to give money to not-for-profit organizations or other governmental entities.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So anyway, I'll spend a little time getting to the bottom of that. I want to actually pull someone in unless it's clear.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So next meeting's next Monday. We're going to circulate some documents, create a list of questions, and get to the bottom of these stabilization funds. And Michelle's going to send us some follow-up on town hall. We'll try to attend some meetings. Some of us will try to attend the meeting tomorrow night.
Follow up on public safety building.
Right. Michelle's going to send us numbers on the public safety building.
Right.
Yeah. Is there anything else we need to discuss this evening?
Nope.
All right, Chris, you've got your hand up. Is that just a legacy or?
Oh, sorry, that's a legacy.
Got it. Okay. Is there perhaps a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you, Corey. We'll take a roll call vote. Susan Franklin,
Susan Franklin, aye.
Mike Dick,
Mike Dick, aye.
Corey Evans,
Craven's eye.
Ralph Dormitzer,
Sir, aye.
Brian Host, aye. The time is 8:11 and we have adjourned. Thanks everybody for your patience. I know we're splitting hairs here, but we do need to understand this. So
Okay.
have a good night.
Good night.
Good night.